Excerpts from Steep Trails. Written by John Muir. Narrated by Michael Anthony Scott. Produced by Thought Audio.
A geologist's winter walk. After reaching Turlock, I sped afoot over the stubble fields and through miles of brown Hemizonia and purple Erigeron to Hopeton, conscious of little more than that the town was behind and beneath me, and the mountains above and before me. On through the oaks and chaparral of the foothills to Coulterville, and then ascended the first great mountain step upon which grows the sugar pine. Here I slackened pace, for I drank the spicy, resiny wind, and beneath the arms of this noble tree, I felt that I was safely home. Never did pine trees seem so dear. How sweet was their breath and their song, and how grandly they winnowed the sky. I tingled my fingers among their tassels, and rustled my feet among their brown needles and burrs, and was exhilarated and joyful beyond all I can write. When I reached Yosemite, all the rocks seemed talkative, and more telling and lovable than ever. They are dear friends, and seem to have warm blood gushing through their granite flesh, and I love them with a love intensified by long and close companionship. After I had bathed in the bright river, sauntered over the meadows, conversed with the domes, and played with the pines, I still felt blurred and weary, as if tainted in some way with the sky of your streets. I determined, therefore, to run for a while to say my prayers in the higher mountain temples. The days are sunful, I said, and though now winter, no great danger need be encountered, and no sudden storm will block my return, if I am watchful. The morning after this decision, I started up the canyon of Tenaya, caring little about the quantity of bread I carried, for I thought, a fast and a storm and a difficult canyon were just the medicine I needed. When I passed Muir Lake, I scarcely noticed it, for I was absorbed in the great Tisiac, her crown a mile away in the hushed azure, her purple granite drapery flowing in soft and graceful folds down to my feet, embroidered gloriously around the deep, shadowy forest. I have gazed on Tisiac 1,000 times, in days of solemn storms, and when her form shone divine with the jewelry of winter, or was veiled in living clouds. And I have heard her voice of winds and snowy tuneful waters when floods were falling, yet never did her soul reveal itself more impressively than now. I hung about her skirts, lingering timidly, until the higher mountains and glaciers compelled me to push up the canyon. This canyon is accessible only to mountaineers, and I was anxious to carry my barometer and clinometer through it to obtain sections and altitudes, so I chose it as the most attractive highway. After I had passed the tall groves that stretch a mile above Muir Lake and scrambled around the Tenaya Fall, which is just at the head of the lake groves, I crept through the dense and spiny chaparral that plushes the roots of the mountains here for miles in warm green, and was ascending a precipitous rock front, smoothed by glacial action, when I suddenly fell, for the first time since I touched foot to Sierra rocks. After several somersaults, I became insensible from the shock, and when consciousness returned, I found myself wedged among short, stiff bushes, trembling as if cold, not injured in the slightest. Judging by the sun, I could not have been insensible very long, probably not a minute, possibly an hour, and I could not remember what made me fall or where I had fallen from. But I saw that if I had rolled a little further, my mountain climbing would have been finished, for just beyond the bushes, the canyon wall steepened, and I might have fallen to the bottom. There said I, addressing my feet, to whose separate skill I had learned to trust night and day on any mountain. That is what you get by intercourse with stupid town stairs and dead pavements. I felt degraded and worthless. I had not yet reached the most difficult portion of the canyon, but I determined to guide my humbled body over the most nerve-trying places I could find, for I was now awake and felt confident that the last of the town fog had been shaken from both head and feet. I camped at the mouth of a narrow gorge which is cut into the bottom of the main canyon, determined to take earnest exercise next day. No plushy boughs did my ill-behaved bones enjoy that night, nor did my bumped head get a spicy cedar plum pillow mixed with flowers. I slept on a naked boulder, and when I awoke, all my nervous trembling was gone. The gorge portion of the canyon, in which I spent all the next day, is about 1.5 miles in length, and I passed the time in tracing the action of the forces that determine this particular bottom gorge, which is an abrupt, ragged wall, narrow-throated canyon, formed in the bottom of the wide-mouthed, smoothed and beveled main canyon. I will not stop now to tell you more. Someday you may see it, like a shadowy line from Cloud's Rest. In high water, the stream occupies all the bottom of the gorge, surging and chafing in glorious power from wall to wall, but the sound of the grinding was low as I entered the gorge, scarcely hoping to be able to pass through its entire length. By cool efforts along grassy, ice-worn slopes, I reached the upper end in a little over a day, but was compelled to pass a second night in the gorge, and in the moonlight I wrote you this short pencil letter in my notebook. The moon is looking down into the canyon, and how marvelously the great rocks kindle to her light. Every dome and brow and swelling boss, touched by her white rays, glows as if lighted with snow. I am now only 1 mile from last night's camp, and have been climbing and sketching all day in this difficult but instructive gorge. It is formed in the bottom of the main canyon, among the roots of Cloud's Rest. It begins at the filled-up lake basin where I camped last night, and ends a few hundred yards above in another basin of the same kind. The walls everywhere are craggy and vertical, and in some places they overlean. It is only from 20 to 60 feet wide, and not, though black and broken enough, the thin, crooked mouth of some mysterious abyss. But it was eroded, for in many places I saw its solid, seamless floor. I am sitting on a big stone, against which the stream divides, and goes brawling by in rapids on both sides. Half of my rock is white in the light, half in shadow. As I look from the opening jaws of the shadowy gorge, South Dome is immediately in front, high in the stars, her face turned from the moon, with the rest of her body gloriously muffled in waved folds of granite. On the left, sculptured from the main Cloud's Rest ridge, are 3 magnificent rocks, sisters of the great South Dome. On the right is a massive moonlit front of Mount Watkins, and between, low down in the furthest distance, is Sentinel Dome, girdled and darkened with forest. In the near foreground, Tenia Creek is singing against the boulders that are white with snow and moonbeams. Now look back 20 yards, and you will see a waterfall fair as a spirit. The moonlight just touches it, bringing it into relief against a dark background of shadow. A little to the left, and a dozen steps this side of the fall, a flickering light marks my camp, and a precious camp it is. A huge glacier-polished slab, falling from the smooth, glossy flank of Cloud's Rest, happened to settle on edge against the wall of the gorge. I did not know that this slab was glacier-polished until I lighted my fire. Judge of my delight. I think it was sent here by an earthquake. It is about 12 feet square. I wish I could take it home for a hearthstone. Beneath this slab is the only place in this torrent-swept gorge where I could find sand sufficient for a bed. I expected to sleep on the boulders, for I spent most of the afternoon on the slippery wall of the canyon, endeavoring to get around this difficult part of the gorge, and was compelled to hasten down here for water before dark. I shall sleep soundly on this sand. Half of it is mica. Here, wonderful to behold, are a few green stems of prickly rubus and a tiny grass. They are here to meet us. I, even here in this darksome gorge, frightened and tormented with raging torrents and choking avalanches of snow. Can it be, as if rubus and the grass leaf were not enough of God's tender prattle words of love, which we so much need in these mighty temples of power, yonder in the benmost bore are 2 blessed adietums. Listen to them. how wholly infused with God is this one big word of love that we call the world. Good night. Do you see the fire glow on my ice-smooth slab and on my 2 ferns and the rubus and grass panicles? And do you hear how sweet a sleep song the fall and cascades are singing? The water-ground chirps and knots that I found fastened between the rocks kept my fire alive all through the night. Next morning, I rose nerved and ready for another day of sketching and noting, and any form of climbing. I escaped from the gorge about noon, after accomplishing some of the most delicate feats of mountaineering I ever attempted. And here the canyon is all broadly open again, the floor luxuriantly forested with pine and spruce and silver fir and brown-trunked libocedrus. The walls rise in Yosemite forms, and Tenaya Creek comes down 700 feet in a white brush of foam. This is a little Yosemite Valley. It is about 2,000 feet above the level of the main Yosemite and about 2,400 below Lake Tenaya. I found the lake frozen, and the ice was so clear and unruffled that the surrounding mountains and the groves that looked down upon it were reflected almost as perfectly as I ever beheld them in the calm evening mirrors of summer. At a little distance, it was difficult to believe the lake frozen at all, and when I walked out on it, cautiously stamping at short intervals to test the strength of the ice, I seemed to walk mysteriously, without adequate faith, on the surface of the water. The ice was so transparent that I could see through it the beautifully wave-rippled sandy bottom and the scales of mica glinting back the downpouring light. When I knelt down with my face to the ice, through which the sunbeams were pouring, I was delighted to discover myriads of Tyndall's 6-rayed waterflowers magnificently colored. A grand old mountain mansion is the Tenaya region. In the glacier period, it was a mer de glace, far grander than the mer de glace of Switzerland, which is only about half a mile broad. The Tenaya mer de glace was not less than 2 miles broad late in the glacier epoch, when all the principal dividing crests were bare, and its depth was not less than 1,500 feet. Ice streams from Mounts Lyell and Dana, and all the mountains between, and from the nearer Cathedral Peak, flowed hither, welded into one, and worked together. After eroding this Tenaya lake basin, and all the splendidly sculptured rocks and mountains that surround and adorn it, and the great Tenaya Canyon, with the wealth of all that makes mountains sublime, they were welded with the vast Self, Lyell, and Illilouette glaciers on one side, and with those of Hoffman on the other, thus forming a portion of a yet grander mer de glace in Yosemite Valley. I reached the Tenaya Canyon on my way home by coming in from the northeast, rambling down over the shoulders of Mount Watkins, touching bottom a mile above Mirror Lake. From thence home was but a saunter in the moonlight. After resting one day, and the weather continuing calm, I ran up over the left shoulder of South Dome and down in front of its grand split face to make some measurements, completed my work, climbed to the right shoulder, struck off along the ridge for Cloud's Rest, and reached the topmost heave of her sunny wave in ample time to see the sunset. Cloud's Rest is 1,000 feet higher than Tissiack. It is a wave-like crest upon a ridge which begins at Yosemite with Tissiack and runs continually eastward to the thicket of peaks and crests around Lake Tenaya. This lofty granite wall is bent this way and that by the restless and weariless action of glaciers, just as if it had been made of dough. But the grand circumference of mountains and forests are coming from far and near, densing into one close assemblage, for the sun, their God and Father, with love ineffable, is glowing a sunset farewell. Not one of all the assembled rocks or trees seemed remote. How impressively their faces shone with responsive love. I ran home in the moonlight with firm strides, for the sun love made me strong. Down through the junipers, down through the firs, now in jet shadows, now in white light, over sandy moraines and bare clanking rocks, past the huge ghost of South Dome rising weird through the firs, past the glorious fall of Nevada, the groves of Illilouette, through the pines of the valley, beneath the bright crystal sky blazing with stars. All of this mountain wealth in one day, one of the rich, ripe days that enlarge one's life, so much of the sun upon one side of it, so much of the moon and stars on the other. A perilous night on Shasta summit. Toward the end of the summer, after a light, open winter, one may reach the summit of Mount Shasta without passing over much snow by keeping on the crest of a long, narrow ridge, mostly bare, that extends from near the campground at the timberline. But on my first excursion to the summit, the whole mountain, down to its low swelling base, was smoothly laden with loose fresh snow, presenting a most glorious mass of winter mountain scenery, in the midst of which I scrambled and reveled or lay snugly snowbound, enjoying the fertile clouds and the snow bloom in all their growing, drifting grandeur. I had walked from Redding, sauntering leisurely from station to station along the old Oregon stage road, the better to see the rocks and plants, birds and people by the way, tracing the Russian Sacramento to its fountains around icy Shasta. The first rains had fallen on the lowlands, and the first snows on the mountains, and everything was fresh and bracing, while an abundance of balmy sunshine filled all the noonday hours. It was the calm afterglow that usually succeeds the first storm of the winter. I met many of the birds that had reared their young and spent their summer in the Shasta woods and chaparral. They were then on their way south to the winter homes, leading their young full-fledged and about as large and strong as the parents. Squirrels, dry and elastic after the storms, were busy about their stores of pine nuts, and the latest goldenrods were still in bloom, though it was now past the middle of October. The grand color glow, the autumnal jubilee of ripe leaves, was past prime, but freshened by the rain, was still making a fine show along the banks of the river and in the ravines and the dells of the smaller stream. At the salmon hatching establishment on the McCloud River, I halted a week to examine the limestone belt, grandly developed there, to learn what I could of the inhabitants of the river and its banks, and to give time for the fresh snow that I knew had fallen on the mountain to settle somewhat, with a view to making the ascent. A pedestrian on these mountain roads, especially so late in the year, is sure to excite curiosity, and many were the interrogations concerning my ramble. When I said that I was simply taking a walk, and that icy Shasta was my mark, I was invariably admonished that I had come on a dangerous quest. The time was far too late. The snow was too loose and deep to climb, and I should be lost in drifts and slides. When I hinted that the new snow was beautiful and storms not so bad as they were called, my advisers shook their heads in token of superior knowledge and declared the ascent of Shasta Butte through loose snow impossible. Nevertheless, before noon of the 2nd of November, I was in the frosty azure of the utmost summit. When I arrived at Cézanne's, everything was quiet. The last of the summer visitors had flitted long before, and the deer and bears also were beginning to seek their winter homes. My barometer and the sign winds and filmy half-transparent clouds that dimmed the sunshine gave notice of the approach of another storm, and I was in haste to be off and get myself established somewhere in the midst of it, whether the summit was to be attained or not. Cézanne, who is a mountaineer, speedily fitted me out for storm or calm as only a mountaineer could, with warm blankets and a week's provisions so generous in quantity and kind that they easily might have been made to last a month in case of my being closely snowbound. Well I knew the weariness of snow climbing and the frost and the dangers of mountaineering so late in the year. Therefore, I could not ask a guide to go with me, even had one been willing. All I wanted was to have blankets and provisions deposited as far up in the timber as the snow would permit a pack animal to go. There I could build a storm nest and lie warm, and make raids up and around the mountain in accordance with the weather. Setting out in the afternoon of November 1st with Jerome Fay, mountaineer and guide, in charge of the animals, I was soon plodding wearily upward through the muffled winter woods, the snow of course growing steadily deeper and looser so that we had to break a trail. The animals began to get discouraged, and after night and darkness came on, they became entangled in a bed of rough lava, where, breaking through 4 or 5 feet of mealy snow, their feet were caught between angular boulders. Here they were in danger of being lost. But after we had removed packs and saddles and assisted their efforts with ropes, they all escaped to the side of a ridge about 1,000 feet below the timberline. To go farther was out of the question, so we were compelled to camp as best we could. A pitch pine fire speedily changed the temperature and shed a blaze of light on the wild lava slope and the straggling storm-bent pines around us. Melted snow answered for coffee, and we had plenty of venison to roast. Toward midnight, I rolled myself in my blankets, slept an hour and a half, arose and ate more venison, tied 2 days' provisions to my belt, and set out for the summit, hoping to reach it ere the coming storm should fall. Jerome accompanied me a little distance above camp and indicated the way as well as he could in the darkness. He seemed loath to leave me, but being reassured that I was at home and required no care, he bade me goodbye and returned to camp, ready to lead his animals down the mountain at daybreak. After I was above the dwarf pines, it was fine practice pushing up the broad unbroken slopes of snow, alone in the solemn silence of the night. Half the sky was clouded, and the other half the stars sparkled icily in the keen, frosty air, while everywhere the glorious wealth of snow fell away from the summit of the cone in flowing folds, more extensive and continuous than any I had ever seen before. When day dawned, the clouds were crawling slowly and becoming more massive, but gave no intimation of immediate danger, and I pushed on faithfully, though holding myself well in hand, ready to return to the timber. For it was easy to see that the storm was not far off. The mountain rises 10,000 feet above the general level of the country, in blank exposure to the deep upper currents of the sky, and no labyrinth of peaks and canyons I had ever been in seemed to me so dangerous as these immense slopes, bare against the sky. The frost was intense, and drifting snow dust made breathing at times rather difficult. The snow was as dry as meal, and the finer particles drifted freely, rising high in the air, while the larger portions of the crystals rolled like sand. I frequently sank to my armpits between buried blocks of loose lava, but generally only to my knees. When tired with walking, I still wallowed slowly upward on all fours. The steepness of the slope, 35 degrees in some places, made any kind of progress fatiguing, while small avalanches were being constantly set in motion in the steepest places. But the bracing air and the sublime beauty of the snowy expanse thrilled every nerve and made absolute exhaustion impossible. I seemed to be walking and wallowing in a cloud, but holding steadily forward, by 10:30 o'clock, I had gained the highest summit. I held my commanding foothold in the sky for 2 hours, gazing on the glorious landscapes spread map-like around the immense horizon, and tracing the outlines of the ancient lava streams extending far into the surrounding plains, and the pathways of vanished glaciers of which Shasta had been the center. But as I had left my coat in camp for the sake of having my limbs free in climbing, I soon was cold. The wind increased in violence, raising the snow in magnificent drifts that were drawn out in the form of wavering banners blowing in the sun. Toward the end of my stay, a succession of small clouds struck against the summit rocks like drifting icebergs, darkening the air as they passed, and producing a chill as definite and sudden as if ice water had been dashed in my face. This is the kind of cloud in which snowflowers grow, and I turned and fled. Finding that I was not closely pursued, I ventured to take time on the way down for a visit to the head of the Whitney Glacier and the crater Butte. After I had reached the end of the main summit ridge, the descent was but little more than one continuous soft, mealy, muffled slide, most luxurious and rapid, though the hissing, swishing speed attained was obscured in great part by flying snow dust, a marked contrast to the boring, sea-wallowing upward struggle. I reached camp about an hour before dusk, hollowed a strip of loose ground in the lee of a large block of red lava where firewood was abundant, rolled myself in my blankets, and went to sleep. Next morning, having slept little the night before the ascent, and being weary with climbing after the excitement was over, I slept late. Then awaking suddenly, my eyes opened on one of the most beautiful and sublime scenes I ever enjoyed. A boundless wilderness of storm clouds of different degrees of ripeness were congregated over all the lower landscape for thousands of square miles, colored gray and purple and pearl and deep glowing white, amid which I seemed to be floating, while the great white cone of the mountain above was all aglow in the free, blazing sunshine. It seemed not so much an ocean as a land of clouds, undulating hill and dale, smooth purple plains, and silvery mountains of cumuli, range over range, diversified with peak and dome and hollow, fully brought out in light and shade. I gazed enchanted, but coal gray masses, drifting like dust on a windswept plain, began to shut out the light, forerunners of the coming storm I had been so anxiously watching. I made haste to gather as much wood as possible, snuggling it as a shelter around my bed. The storm side of my blankets was fastened down with stakes to reduce as much as possible the sifting in of drift and the danger of being blown away. The precious bread sack was placed safely as a pillow, and when at length the first flakes fell, I was exultingly ready to welcome them. Most of my firewood was more than half rosin and would blaze in the face of the fiercest drifting. The winds could not demolish my bed, and my bread could be made to last indefinitely, while in case of need, I had the means of making snowshoes and could retreat or hold my ground as I pleased. Presently, the storm broke forth in full snowy bloom, and the thronging crystals darkened the air. The wind swept past in hissing floods, grinding the snow into meal and sweeping down into the hollows in enormous drifts all the heavier particles, while the finer dust was sifted through the sky, increasing the icy gloom. But my fire glowed bravely, as if in glad defiance of the drift to quench it, and notwithstanding but little trace of my nest could be seen after the snow had leveled and buried it, I was snug and warm, and the passionate uproar produced a glad excitement. Day after day the storm continued, piling snow on snow in weariless abundance. There were short periods of quiet, when the sun would seem to look eagerly down through rents in the clouds, as if to know how the work was advancing. During these calm intervals, I replenished my fire, sometimes without leaving the nest, for fire and woodpile were so near this could easily be done, or busied myself with my notebook, watching the gestures of the trees in taking the snow, examining separate crystals under a lens, and learning their methods of their deposition as an enduring fountain for their streams. Several times, when the storm ceased for a few minutes, a Douglas squirrel came frisking from the foot of a clump of dwarf pines, moving in sudden, interrupted spurts over the bossy snow. Then, without any apparent guidance, he would dig rapidly into the drift where were buried some grains of barley that the horses had left. The Douglas squirrel does not strictly belong to these upper woods, and I was surprised to see him out in such weather. The mountain sheep also, quite a large flock of them, came to my camp and took shelter beside a clump of matted dwarf pines a little above my nest. The storm lasted about a week, but before it was ended, Sasan became alarmed and sent up the guide with animals to see what had become of me and recover the camp outfit. The news spread that there was a man on the mountain, and he must surely have perished, and Sasan was blamed for allowing anyone to attempt climbing in such weather, while I was safe as anybody in the lowlands, lying like a squirrel in a warm, fluffy nest, busied about my own affairs and wishing only to be let alone. Later, however, a trail could not have been broken for a horse, and some of the camp furniture would have to be abandoned. On the 5th day, I returned to Sasan's, and from the comfortable base made excursions as the weather permitted to the Black Butte, to the foot of the Whitney Glacier, around the base of the mountain to Rhett and Klamath Lakes, to the Modoc region and elsewhere, developing many interesting scenes and experiences. But the next spring, on the other side of this eventful winter, I saw and felt still more of the Shasta snow. For then it was my fortune to get into the heart of a storm and to be held in it for a long time. On the 28th of April, 1875, I led a party up the mountain for the purpose of making a survey of the summit with reference to the location of the geodetic monument. On the 30th, accompanied by Jerome Fay, I made another ascent to make some barometrical observations. The day intervening between the two ascents being devoted to establishing a camp on the extreme edge of the timberline. Here on our red tracheate bed, we obtained 2 hours of shallow sleep broken for occasional glimpses of the keen starry night. At 2 o'clock we rose, breakfast on a warm tinful cup of coffee and a piece of frozen venison broiled in the coals, and started for the summit. Up to this time, there was nothing in sight that betokened the approach of a storm. But on gaining the summit, we saw toward Lassen's Butte hundreds of square miles of white cumuli boiling dreamily in the sunshine far beneath us, and causing no alarm. The slight weariness of the ascent was soon rested away, and our glorious morning in the sky promised nothing but enjoyment. At 9 a.m., the dry thermometer stood at 34 degrees in the shade and rose steadily until 1 p.m. It stood at 50 degrees, probably influenced somewhat by radiation from the sun-warmed cliffs. A common bumblebee, not at all benumbed, zigzagged vigorously about our heads for a few moments, as if unconscious of the fact that the nearest honey flower was a mile beneath him. In the meantime, clouds were growing down in Shasta Valley, massive swelling cumuli displaying delicious tones of purple and gray in the hollows of their sun-beaten bosses. Extending gradually southward around on both sides of Shasta, these at length united with the older fields toward Lassen's Butte, thus encircling Mount Shasta in one continuous cloud zone. Rhett and Klamath Lakes were eclipsed beneath clouds scarcely less brilliant than their own silvery disks. The Modoc lava beds, many a snow-laden peak far north in Oregon, the Scott and Trinity and Siskiyou Mountains, the peaks of the Sierra, the Blue Coast Range, Shasta Valley, the dark forest filling the valley of the Sacramento, all in turn were obscured or buried, leaving the lofty cone on which we stood solitary in the sunshine between two skies. A sky of spotless blue above, a sky of glittering cloud beneath. The creative sun shone glorious on the vast expanse of cloudland. Hill and dale, mountain and valley, springing into existence, responsive to his rays, and steadily developing in beauty and individuality. One huge mountain cone of cloud, corresponding to Mount Shasta in these newborn cloud ranges, rose close alongside with a visible motion, its firm, polished bosses seeming so near and substantial that we almost fancied that we might leap down upon them from where we stood and make our way to the lowlands. No hint was given by anything in their appearance of the fleeting character of these most sublime and beautiful cloud mountains. On the contrary, they impressed one as being lasting additions to the landscape. The weather of the springtime and summer throughout the Sierra in general is usually varied by slight local rains and dustings of snow, most of which are obviously far too joyous and life-giving to be regarded as storms. Single clouds growing in the sunny sky, ripening in an hour, showering the heated landscape, and passing away like a thought, leaving no visible bodily remains to stain the sky. Snowstorms of the same gentle kind abound among the high peaks, but in spring they not infrequently attain larger proportions, assuming a violence and energy of expression scarcely surpassed by those bred in the depths of winter. Such was the storm now gathering about us. It began to declare itself shortly after noon, suggesting to us the idea of at once seeking our safe camp in the timber and abandoning the purpose of making an observation of the barometer at 3 p.m., 2 having already been made at 9 a.m. and 12 meridian, while simultaneous observations were made at Strawberry Valley. Jerome peered at short intervals over the ridge, contemplating the rising clouds with anxious gestures in the rough wind, and at length declared that if we did not make a speedy escape, we should be compelled to pass the rest of the day and night on the summit. But anxiety to complete my observations stifled my own instinctive promptings to retreat and held me to my work. No inexperienced person was depending on me, and I told Jerome that we two mountaineers should be able to make our way down through any storm likely to fall. Presently thin, fibrous films of cloud began to blow directly over the summit from north to south, drawn out in long fairy webs like carded wool, forming and dissolving as if by magic. The wind twisted them into ringlets and whirled them in a succession of graceful convolutions like the outside sprays of Yosemite Falls in flood time. Then sailing out into the thin azure over the precipitous brink of the ridge, they were drifted together like wreaths of foam on a river. These higher and finer cloud fabrics were evidently produced by the chilling of the air from its own expansion, caused by the upward deflection of the wind against the slopes of the mountain. They steadily increased on the north rim of the cone, forming at length a thick, opaque, ill-defined embankment from the icy meshes of which snowflowers began to fall, alternating with hail. The sky speedily darkened, and just as I had completed my last observation and boxed my instruments ready for the descent, the storm began in serious earnest. At first, the cliffs were beaten with hail, every stone of which, as far as I could see, was regular in form, six-sided pyramids with rounded base, rich and sumptuous looking, and fashioned with loving care, yet seemingly thrown away on those desolate crags down which they went rolling, falling, sliding in a network of curious streams. After we had forced our way down the ridge and past the group of hissing fumaroles, the storm became inconceivably violent. The thermometer fell 22 degrees in a few minutes and soon dropped below zero. The hail gave place to snow, and darkness came on like night. The wind, rising to the highest pitch of violence, boomed and surged amid the desolate crags. Lightning flashes in quick succession cut the gloomy darkness, and the thunders, the most tremendously loud and appalling I ever heard, made an almost continuous roar, stroke following stroke in quick, passionate succession, as though the mountain were being rent to its foundations and the fires of the old volcano were breaking forth again. Could we at once have begun to descend the snow slopes leading to the timber, we might have made good our escape, however dark and wild the storm. As it was, we had first to make our way along a dangerous ridge nearly a mile and a half long, flanked in many places by steep ice slopes at the head of the Whitney Glacier on one side and by shattered precipices on the other. Apprehensive of this coming darkness, I had taken the precaution when the storm began to make the most dangerous points clear to my mind and to mark their relations with reference to the direction of the wind. When therefore the darkness came on and the bewildering drift, I felt confident that we could force our way through it with no other guidance. After passing the hot springs, I halted in the lee of a lava block to let Jerome, who had fallen a little behind, come up. Here he opened a council in which, under circumstances sufficiently exciting, but without evincing any bewilderment, he maintained, in opposition to my views, that it was impossible to proceed. He firmly refused to make the venture to find camp, while I, aware of the dangers that would necessarily attend our efforts, and conscious of being the cause of his present peril, decided not to leave him. Our discussion ended. Jerome made a dash from the shelter of the lava block and began forcing his way back against the wind to the hot springs, wavering and struggling to resist being carried away as if he were fording a rapid stream. After waiting and watching in vain for some flaw in the storm that might be urged as a new argument in favor of attempting the descent, I was compelled to follow. Here, said Jerome, as we shivered in the midst of the hissing, sputtering fumaroles, yet we shall be safe from frost. Yes, said I, we can lie in this mud and steam and sludge, warm at least on one side, but how can we protect our lungs from the acid gases, and how, after our clothing is saturated, shall we be able to reach camp without freezing, even after the storm is over. We shall have to wait for sunshine, and when will it come? The tempered area to which we had committed ourselves extended over about 1/4 of an acre, but it was only about 1/8 of an inch in thickness, for the scalding gas jets were shorn off close to the ground by the oversweeping flood of frosty wind. How lavishly the snow fell only mountaineers may know, but the crisp, crystal flowers seemed to touch one another and fairly to thicken the tremendous blast that carried them. This was the bloom time, the summer of the cloud, and never before have I seen even a mountain cloud flowering so profusely. When the bloom of the Shasta chaparral is falling, the ground is sometimes covered for hundreds of square miles to a depth of 1/2 an inch. But the bloom of this fertile snow cloud grew and matured and fell to a depth of 2 feet in a few hours. Some crystals landed with their rays almost perfect, but most of them were worn and broken by striking against one another or by rolling on the ground. The touch of these snowflowers in calm weather is infinitely gentle, glinting, swaying, setting silently in the dry mountain air, or massed in flakes, soft and downing. To lie out alone in the mountains of a still night and be touched by the first of these small silent messengers from the sky is a memorable experience, and the fineness of that touch none will forget. But the storm blast laden with crisp, sharp snow seems to crush and bruise and stupefy with its multitude of stings, and compels the bravest to turn and flee. The snow fell without abatement until an hour or two after what seemed to be the natural darkness of the night. Up to the time the storm first broke on the summit, its development was remarkably gentle. There was a deliberate growth of clouds, a weaving of translucent tissue above, then the roar of the wind and the thunder, and the darkening flight of snow. Its subsidence was not less sudden. The clouds broke and vanished. Not a crystal was left in the sky, and the stars shone out with pure and tranquil radiance. During the storm, we lay on our backs so as to present as little surface as possible to the wind, and to let the drift pass over us. The mealy snow sifted into the folds of our clothing, and in many places reached the skin. We were glad at first to see the snow packing about us, hoping it would deaden the force of the wind, but it soon froze into a stiff, crusty heap as the temperature fell, rather augmenting our novel misery. When the heat became unendurable, on some spot where steam was escaping through the sludge, we tried to stop it with snow and mud, or shift it a little at a time by shoving with our heels, for to stand in blank exposure to the fearful wind in our frozen and broiled condition seemed certain death. The acrid incrustations sublimed from the escaping gases frequently gave way, opening new vents to scald us. And fearing that if at any time the wind should fall, carbonic acid, which often formed a considerable portion of the gaseous exhalations of volcanoes, might collect in sufficient quantities to cause sleep and death. I warned Jerome against forgetting himself for a single moment, even should his sufferings admit of such a thing. Accordingly, when during the long dreary watches of the night we roused from a state of half-consciousness, we called each other by name in a frightened, startled way, each fearing the other might be benumbed or dead. The ordinary sensations of cold give but a faint conception of that which comes on after hard climbing with want of food and sleep in such exposure as this. Life is then seen to be a fire that now smolders, now brightens, and may be easily quenched. The weary hours wore away like dim, half-forgotten years, so long and eventful they seemed, though we did nothing but suffer. Still, the pain was not always of that bitter, intense kind that precludes thought and takes away all capacity for enjoyment. A sort of dreamy stupor came on at times, in which we fancied we saw dry resinous logs suitable for campfires, just as after going days without food, men fancy they see bread. Frozen, blistered, famished, benumbed, our bodies seem lost to us at times, all dead but the eyes. For the duller and fainter we became, the clearer was our vision, though only in momentary glimpses. Then, after the sky cleared, we gazed at the stars, blessed immortals of light, shining shining with marvelous brightness with long lance rays, near-looking and new-looking, as if never seen before. Again, they would look familiar and remind us of stargazing at home. Oftentimes, imagination coming into play would present charming pictures of the warm zone below, mingled with others near and far. Then the bitter wind and the drift would break the blissful vision, and dreary pains cover us like clouds. "Are you suffering much?" Jerome would inquire with pitiful faintness. Yes, I would say, striving to keep my voice brave. Frozen and burned, but never mind, Jerome. The night will wear away at last, and tomorrow we go a-Maying, and what campfires we will make, and what sunbaths we will take. The frost grew more and more intense, and we became icy and covered over with a crust of frozen snow, as if we had lain cast away in the drift all winter. In about 13 hours, every hour like a year, day began to dawn, but it was long ere the summit's rocks were touched by the sun. No clouds were visible from where we lay, yet the morning was dull and blue and bitterly frosty, and hour after hour passed by while we eagerly watched the pale light stealing down the ridge to the hollow where we lay. But there was not a trace of that warm, flushing sunrise splendor we so long had hoped for. As the time drew near to make an effort to reach camp, we became concerned to know what strength was left us, and whether or no we could walk. For we had lain flat all this time without once rising to our feet. Mountaineers, however, always find in themselves a reserve of power after great exhaustion. It is a kind of second life, available only in emergencies like this. And having proved its existence, I had no great fear that either of us would fail, though one of my arms was already benumbed and hung powerless. At length, after the temperature was somewhat mitigated on this memorable 1st of May, we arose and began to struggle homeward. Our frozen trousers could scarcely be made to bend at the knee, and we waded the snow with difficulty. The summit ridge was fortunately windswept and nearly bare, so we were not compelled to lift our feet high, and on reaching the long home slopes laden with loose snow, we made rapid progress, sliding and shuffling and pitching headlong, our feebleness accelerating rather than diminishing our speed. When we had descended some 3,000 feet, the sunshine warmed our backs and we began to revive. At 10 a.m., we reached the timber and were safe. Half an hour later, we heard Sassoon shouting down among the firs, coming with horses to take us to the hotel. After breaking a trail through the snow as far as possible, he had tied his animals and walked up. We had been so long without food that we cared but little about eating, but we eagerly drank the coffee he prepared for us. Our feet were frozen, and thawing them was painful, and had to be done very slowly by keeping them buried in soft snow for several hours, which avoided permanent damage. 5,000 feet below the summit, we found only 3 inches of new snow, and at the base of the mountain, only a slight shower of rain had fallen, showing how local our storm had been, notwithstanding its terrific fury. Our feet were wrapped in sacking, and we were soon mounted and on our way down into the thick sunshine. God's country, as Sasson calls the Chaparral Zone. In 2 hours' ride, the last snowbank was left behind. Violets appeared along the edges of the trail, and the chaparral was coming into bloom, with young lilies and larkspurs about the open places in rich profusion. How beautiful seemed the golden sunbeams streaming through the woods between the warm brown boles of the cedars and pines. All of my friends among the birds and plants seemed like old friends, and we felt like speaking to every one of them as we passed, as if we had been a long time away in some far, strange country. In the afternoon, we reached Strawberry Valley and fell asleep. Next morning, we seemed to have risen from the dead. My bedroom was flooded with sunshine, and from the window I saw the great white Shasta cone clad in forest and clouds, and bearing them loftily in the sky. Everything seemed full and radiant with the freshness and beauty and enthusiasm of youth. Sisan's children came in with flowers and covered my bed, and the storm on the mountaintop vanished like a dream. Nevada's Dead Towns. Nevada is one of the very youngest and wildest of the states. Nevertheless, it is already strewn with ruins that seem as gray and silent and time-worn as if the civilization to which they belong had perished centuries ago. Yet strange to say, all these ruins are results of mining efforts made within the last few years. Wander where you may throughout the length and breadth of this mountain-bared wilderness, you everywhere come up upon these dead mining towns, with their tall chimney stacks, standing forlorn amid broken walls and furnaces, and machinery half buried in sand. The very names of many of them already forgotten amid the excitements of later discoveries, and now known only through tradition 10 years old. While exploring the mountain ranges of the state during a considerable portion of 3 summers, I think that I have seen at least 5 of these deserted towns and villages for everyone in ordinary life. Some of them were probably only camps built by bands of prospectors and inhabited for a few months or years, while some specially interesting canyon was being explored and then carelessly abandoned for more promising fields. But many were real towns, regularly laid out and incorporated, containing well-built hotels, churches, schoolhouses, post offices, and jails, as well as the mills on which they all depended, and whose well-graded streets were filled with lawyers, doctors, brokers, hangmen, real estate agents, etc., the whole population numbering several thousand. A few years ago, the population of Hamilton is said to have been nearly 8,000, that of Treasure Hill 6,000, of Shermantown 7,000, of Swansea 3,000. All of these were incorporated towns with mayors, councils, fire departments, and daily newspapers. Hamilton has now about 100 inhabitants, most of whom are merely waiting in dreary inaction for something to turn up. Treasure Hill has about half as many, Shermantown 1 family, and Swansea none, while on the other hand, the graveyards are far too full. In one canyon of the Toyabe Range near Austin, I found no less than 5 dead towns without a single inhabitant. The streets and blocks of real estate graded on the hillsides are rapidly falling back into the wilderness. Sagebrushes are growing up around the forges of the blacksmith shops, and lizards bask on the crumbling walls. While traveling southward from Austin down Big Smoky Valley, I noticed a remarkably tall and imposing column, rising like a lone pine out of the sagebrush on the edge of a dry gulch. This proved to be a smokestack of solid masonry. It seemed strangely out of place in the desert, as if it had been transported entire from the heart of some noisy manufacturing town and left here by mistake. I learned afterwards that it belonged to a set of furnaces that were built by a New York company to smelt ore that was never found. The tools of the workmen are still lying in place beside the furnaces, as if dropped in some sudden Indian or earthquake panic and never afterwards handled. These imposing ruins, together with the desolate town, lying a quarter of a mile to the northward, present a most vivid picture of wasted effort. Coyotes now wander unmolested through the brushy streets, and of all the busy throng that so lavishly spent their time and money here, only one man remains, a lone bachelor with one suspender. Mining discoveries in progress, retrogression and decay seem to have been crowded more closely against each other here than on any other portion of the globe. Some one of the band of adventurous prospectors who came from the exhausted placers of California would discover some rich ore. How much or little mattered not at first. These specimens fell among excited seekers after wealth like sparks in gunpowder, and in a few days the wilderness was disturbed with the noisy clang of miners and builders. A little town would then spring up, and before anything like a careful survey of any particular lode would be made, a company would be formed and expensive mills built. Then after all the machinery was ready for the ore, perhaps little or none at all was to be found. Meanwhile, another discovery was reported, and the young town was abandoned as completely as a camp made for a single night, and so on until some really valuable lode was found, such as those of Eureka, Austin, Virginia, etc., which formed the substantial groundwork for 1,000 other excitements. Passing through the dead town of Shelbourne last month, I asked one of the few lingering inhabitants why the town was built. "For the mines," he replied. "And where are the mines?" "On the mountains back here." "And why were they abandoned?" I asked. "Are they exhausted?" "Oh no," he replied, "they are not exhausted. On the contrary, they have never been worked at all, for unfortunately, just as we were about ready to open them, the Cherry Creek mines were discovered across the valley in the Egan Range, and everybody rushed off there, taking what they could with them, houses, machinery, and all. But we are hoping that somebody with money and speculation will come and revive us yet." The dead mining excitements of Nevada were far more intense and destructive in their action than those of California, because the prizes at stake were greater, while more skill was required to gain them. The long trains of gold seekers making their way to California had ample time and means to recover from their first attacks of mining fever while crawling laboriously across the plains. And on their arrival on any portion of the Sierra Gold Belt, they at once began to make money. No matter in which gulch or canyon they worked, some measure of success was sure, however unskillful they might be. And though while making $10 a day, they might be agitated by hopes of making 20, or striking their picks against $100 or $1,000 nuggets, men of ordinary nerve could still work on with comparative steadiness and remain rational. But in the case of the Nevada miner, he too often spent himself in years of weary search without gaining a dollar, traveling hundreds of miles from mountain to mountain, burdened with wasting hopes of discovering some hidden vein worth millions, enduring hardships of the most destructive kind, driving innumerable tunnels into the hillsides, while his assayed specimens again and again proved worthless. Perhaps 1 in 100 of these brave prospectors would strike it rich, while 99 died alone in the mountains or sank out of sight in the corners of saloons in a haze of whiskey and tobacco smoke. The healthful ministry of wealth is blessed, and surely it is a fine thing that so many are eager to find the gold and silver that lie hid in the veins of the mountains. But in the search, the seekers too often become insane and strike out blindly in the dark like raving madmen. 750 tons of ore from the original Eberhart mine on Treasure Hill yielded $1.5 million. The whole of this immense sum having been obtained within 250 feet of the surface, the greater portion within 140 feet. Other ore masses were scarcely less marvelously rich, giving rise to one of the most violent excitements that ever occurred in the history of mining. All kinds of people, shoemakers, tailors, farmers, etc., as well as miners, left their own right work and fell in a perfect storm of energy upon the White Pine Hills, covering the ground like grasshoppers, and seeming determined by the very violence of their efforts to turn every stone to silver. But with few exceptions, these mining storms pass away about as suddenly as they rise, leaving only ruins to tell of the tremendous energy expended, as heaps of giant boulders in the valley tell of the spent power of the mountain floods. In marked contrast with this destructive unrest is the orderly deliberation into which miners settle in developing a truly valuable mine. At Eureka, we were kindly led through the treasure chambers of the Richmond and Eureka Consolidated, our guides leisurely leading the way from level to level, calling attention to the precious ore masses which the workmen were slowly breaking to pieces with their picks, like navvies wearing away the day in a railroad cutting. While down at the smelting works, the bars of bullion were handled with less eager haste than the farmer shows in gathering his sheaves. The wealth Nevada has already given to the world is indeed wonderful, but the only grand marvel is the energy expended in its development. The amount of prospecting done in the face of so many dangers and sacrifices the innumerable tunnels and shafts bored into the mountains, the mills that have been built, these would seem to require a race of giants. But in full view of the substantial results achieved, the pure waste manifest in the ruins one meets never fails to produce a saddening effect. The dim old ruins of Europe, so eagerly sought after by travelers, has something pleasing about them, whatever their historical associations, for they at least lend some beauty to the landscape. Their picturesque towers and arches seem to be kindly adopted by nature and planted with wildflowers and wreathed with ivy, while their rugged angles are soothed and freshened and embossed with green mosses, fresh life, and decay mingling in pleasing measures, and the whole vanishing softly like a ripe, tranquil day fading into night. So also among the older ruins of the East there is a fitness felt. They have served their time, and like the weather-beaten mountains, are wasting harmoniously. The same is in some degree true of the dead mining towns of California. But those lying to the eastward of the Sierra, throughout the ranges of the Great Basin, waste in the dry wilderness like the bones of cattle that have died of thirst. Many of them do not represent any good accomplishment and have no right to be. They are monuments of fraud and ignorance, sins against science. The drifts and tunnels in the rocks may perhaps be regarded as the prayers of the prospector, offered for the wealth he so earnestly craves. But like prayers of any kind not in harmony with nature, they are unanswered. But after all, effort, however misapplied, is better than stagnation. Better toil blindly, beating every stone in turn for grains of gold, whether they contain any or not, than lie down in apathetic decay. The fever period is fortunately passing away. The prospector is no longer the raving, wandering ghoul of 10 years ago, rushing in random lawlessness among the hills, hungry and footsore, but cool and skillful, well supplied with every necessary, and clad in his right mind. Capitalists, too, and the public in general, have become wiser, and do not take fire so readily from mining sparks. While at the same time, a vast amount of real work is being done, and the ratio between growth and decay is constantly becoming better. People and towns of Puget Sound. As one strolls in the woods about the logging camps, most of the lumbermen are found to be interesting people to meet, kind and obliging and sincere, full of knowledge concerning the bark and sapwood and the heartwood of the trees they cut, and how to fell them without unnecessary breakage on the ground where they may be most advantageously sawed into logs and loaded for removal. The work is hard, and all of the older men have a tired, somewhat haggard appearance. Their faces are doubtful in color, neither sickly nor quite healthy looking, and seamed with deep wrinkles like the bark of the spruces, but with no trace of anxiety. Their clothing is full of rosin and never wears out. A little of everything in the woods is stuck fast to these loggers, and their trousers grow constantly thicker with age. In all their movements and gestures, they are heavy and deliberate like the trees above them, and they walk with a swaying, rocking gait altogether free from quick, jerky fussiness, for chopping and log rolling have quenched all that. They are also slow of speech, as if partly out of breath, and when one tries to draw them out on some subject away from logs, all the fresh, leafy, outreaching branches of the mind seem to have been withered and killed with fatigue, leaving their lives little more than dry lumber. Many a tree have these old axemen felled. Many of their companions are already beneath the moss, and among those that we see at work, some are now dead at the top, bald, leafless, so to speak, and tottering to their fall. A very different man, seen now and then at long intervals, but usually invisible, is the free roamer of the wilderness, hunter, prospector, explorer, seeking he knows not what. Lithe and sinewy, he walks erect, making his way with the skill of wild animals, all his senses in action, watchful and alert, looking keenly at everything in sight, his imagination well nourished in the wealth of the wilderness, coming into contact with free nature in 1,000 forms, drinking at the fountains of things, responsive to wild influences as trees to the winds. Well he knows the wild animals, his neighbors, what fishes are in the streams, what birds in the forest, and where food may be found. Hungry at times and weary, he has corresponding enjoyment in eating and resting, and all the wilderness is home. Some of these rare happy rovers die alone among the trees. Others half settle down and change in part into farmers, each making choice of some fertile spot where the landscape attracts him, builds a small cabin, where, with few wants to supply from garden or field, he hunts and farms in turn, going perhaps once a year to the settlements until night begins to draw near, and like forest shadows thickens into darkness, and his day is done. In these Washington wilds, living alone, all sorts of men may perchance be found, poets, philosophers, and even full-blown transcendentalists, though you may go far to find them. Indians are seldom to be met with away from the Sound, except about the few outlying hop ranches to which they resort in great numbers during the picking season. Nor in your walks in the woods will you be likely to see many of the wild animals, however far you may go, with the exception of the Douglas squirrel and the mountain goat. The squirrel is everywhere, and the goat you can hardly fail to find if you climb any of the high mountains. The deer, once very abundant, may still be found on the islands and along the shores of the Sound, but the large gray wolves render their existence next to impossible at any considerable distance back in the woods of the mainland, as they can easily run them down unless they are near enough to the coast to make their escape by plunging into the water and swimming to the islands offshore. The elk, and perhaps also the moose, still exist in the most remote and inaccessible solitudes of the forest, but their numbers have been greatly reduced of late, and even the most experienced hunters have difficulty in finding them. Of bears there are two species, the black and the large brown, the former by far the more common of the two. On the shaggy bottomlands where berries are plentiful, and along the rivers while salmon are going up to spawn, the black bear may be found, fat and at home. Many are killed every year, both for their flesh and skins. The large brown species likes higher and opener ground. He is a dangerous animal, a near relative of the famous grizzly, and wise hunters are very fond of letting him alone. The towns of Puget Sound are of a very lively, progressive, and aspiring kind, fortunately with abundance of substance about them to warrant their ambition and make them grow. Like young sapling sequoias, they are sending out their roots far and near for nourishment, counting confidently on longevity and grandeur of stature. Seattle and Tacoma are at present far in the lead of all others in the race for supremacy, and these two are keen, active rivals, to all appearances well matched. Tacoma occupies near the head of the South a site of great natural beauty. It is the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad and calls itself the City of Destiny. Seattle is also charmingly located about 20 miles down the south from Tacoma on Elliott Bay. It is the terminus of the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railroad, now in process of construction, and calls itself the Queen City of the Sound and the metropolis of Washington. What the population of these towns number, I am not able to say with anything like exactness. They are probably about the same size, and they each claim to have about 20,000 people. But their figures are so rapidly changing and so often mixed up with the counts that refer to the future that exact measurements of either of these places are about as hard to obtain as measurements of the clouds of a growing storm. Their edges run back for miles into the woods among the trees and stumps and brush, which hide a good many of the houses and the stakes which mark the lots, so that without being as yet very large towns, they seem to fade away into the distance. But though young and loose-jointed, They are fast taking on the forms and manners of old cities, putting on airs, as some would say, like boys in haste to be men. They are already towns with all modern improvements, first class in every particular, as is said of hotels. They have electronic motors and lights, paved broadways and boulevards, substantial business blocks, schools, churches, factories, and foundries. The lusty titanic clang of boiler-making may be heard there, and plenty of the languid music of pianos mingling with the babble noises of commerce carried on in 100 tongues. The main streets are crowded with bright, wide-awake lawyers, ministers, merchants, agents for everything under the sun. Ox drivers and loggers in stiff, gummy overalls, back-slanting dudes, well-tailored and shiny, and fashions and bonnets of every feather and color bloom gaily in the noisy throng and advertise London and Paris. Vigorous life and strife are to be seen everywhere. The spirit of progress is in the air. Still, it is hard to realize how much good work is being done here of a kind that makes for civilization. The enthusiastic, exulting energy displayed in the building of new towns, railroads and mills, in the opening of mines of coal and iron, and the development of natural resources in general. To many, especially in the Atlantic states, Washington is hardly known at all. It is regarded as being yet a far Wild West, a dim, nebulous expanse of woods, by those who do not know that railroads and steamers have brought the country out of the wilderness and abolished the old distances. It is now near to all the world, and is in possession of a share of the best of all that civilization has to offer, while on some of the lines of advancement it is at the front. Notwithstanding the sharp rivalry between different sections and towns, the leading men mostly pull together for the general good and glory, building, buying, borrowing, to push the country to its place. Keeping arithmetic busy in counting population present and to come, ships, towns, factories, tons of coal and iron, feet of lumber, miles of railroad, Americans, Scandinavian, Irish, Scotch and Germans, being joined together in the white heat of work like religious crowds in time of revival who have forgotten sectarianism. It is a fine thing to see people in hot earnest about anything. Therefore, however extravagant and high the brag ascending from Puget Sound, in most cases it is likely to appear pardonable and more. Seattle was named after an old Indian chief who lived in this part of the Sound. He was very proud of the honor and lived long enough to lead his grandchildren about the streets. The greater part of the lower business portion of the town, including a long stretch of wharves and warehouses built on piles, was destroyed by a fire a few months ago with immense loss. The people, however, are in no wise discouraged, and ere long the loss will be gain, inasmuch as a better class of buildings, chiefly of brick, are being erected in place of the inflammable wooden ones, which, with comparatively few exceptions, were built of pitchy spruce. With their own scenery so glorious ever on show, one would at first thought, suppose that these Puget Sound people would never go sightseeing from home like less favored mortals. But they do all the same. Some go boating on the Sound or on the lakes and rivers, or with their families make excursions at small cost on the steamers. Others will take the train to the Franklin and Newcastle or Carbon River coal mines for the sake of the 30 or 40-mile rides through the woods and a look into the black depths of the underworld. Others again take the steamers for Victoria, Fraser River, or Vancouver, the new ambitious town at the terminus of the Canadian Railroad, thus getting views of the outer world in a near foreign country. One of the regular summer resorts of this region, where people go for fishing, hunting, and the healing of diseases, is the Green River Hot Springs in the Cascade Mountains, 61 miles east of Tacoma, on the line of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Green River is a small rocky stream with picturesque banks and derives its name from the beautiful pale green hue of its waters. Among the most interesting of all the summer rest and pleasure places is the famous Hop Ranch on the upper Snoqualmie River, 30 or 40 miles eastward from Seattle. Here the dense forest opens, allowing fine free views of the adjacent mountains from a long stretch of ground which is half meadow, half prairie, level and fertile, and beautifully diversified with outstanding groves of spruces and alders and rich flowery fringes of spirea and wild roses, the river meandering deep and tranquil through the midst of it. On the portions most easily cleared, some 300 acres of hop vines have been planted and are now in full bearing, yielding, it is said, at the rate of about a ton of hops to the acre. They are a beautiful crop, these vines of the north. Pillars of verdure in regular rows, 7 feet apart and 8 or 10 feet in height. The long, vigorous shoots sweeping round in fine, wild freedom, and the light, leafy cones hanging in loose, handsome clusters. Perhaps enough of hops might be raised in Washington for the wants of all the world, but it would be impossible to find pickers to handle the crop. Most of the picking is done by Indians, and to this fine, clean, profitable work, they come in great numbers in their canoes, old and young, of many different tribes, bringing wives and children and household goods, in some cases from a distance of 500 or 600 miles, even from far Alaska. Then they too grow rich and spend their money on red cloth and trinkets. About 1,000 Indians are required as pickers at the Snoqualmie Ranch alone, at a lively and merry picture they make in the field, arrayed in bright, showy calicos, luring the rustling vine pillars with incessant song-singing and fun. Still more striking are their queer camps on the edges of the fields or over on the river bank, with the firelight shining on their wild, jolly faces. But woe to the ranch should firewater get there. But the chief attractions here are not found in the hops, but in trout fishing and bear hunting, and in the 2 fine falls on the river. Formerly the trip from Seattle was a hard one, over corduroy roads. Now it is reached in a few hours by rail along the shores of Lake Washington and Lake Squat to a fine sample section of the forest and past the brow of the main Snoqualmie Fall. From the hotel at the ranch village, the road to the fall leads down the right bank of the river through the magnificent maple woods I have mentioned elsewhere, and fine views of the fall may be had on that side, both from above and below. It is situated on the main river, where it plunges over a sheer precipice about 240 feet high and leaving the level meadows of the ancient lake basin. In a general way, it resembles the well-known Nevada Fall in Yosemite, having the same twisted appearance at the top and the free plunge in numberless comet-shaped masses into a deep pool 75 or 80 yards in diameter. The pool is of considerable depth, as is shown by the radiating well-beaten foam and mist, which is of a beautiful rose color at times, of exquisite fineness of tone, and by the heavy waves that lash the rocks in front of it. Though to a Californian, the height of this fall would not seem great, the volume of water is heavy, and all the surroundings are delightful. The maple forest, of itself worth a long journey, the beauty of the river reaches above and below, and the views down the valley afar over the mighty forests, with all its lovely trimmings and ferns and flowers, make this one of the most interesting falls I have ever seen. The upper fall is about 75 feet high, with bouncing rapids at head and foot, set in a romantic dell thatched with dripping mosses and ferns, and embowered in dense evergreens and blooming brushes, the distance to it from the upper end of the meadows being about 8 miles. The road leads through majestic woods with ferns 10 feet high beneath some of the thickets, and across a gravelly plain deforested by fire many years ago. Orange lilies are plentiful, and handsome shining mats of the kinnikinick sprinkled with bright scarlet berries. From a place called Hunt's at the end of the wagon road, a trail leads through lush-dripping woods, never dry, to Thuya and Mertens, Menzies, and Douglas spruces. The ground is covered with the best mosswork of the moist lands of the north, made up mostly of the various species of hypnum, with some liverworts, marchantia, juggermania, etc., in broad sheets and bosses, where never a dust particle floated, and where all the flowers, fresh with mist and spray, are wetter than water lilies. The pool at the foot of the fall is a place surprisingly lovely to look at, with the enthusiastic rush and song of the falls, the majestic trees overhead leaning over the brink like listeners eager to catch every word of the white refreshing waters. The delicate maidenhairs and aspleniums with fronds outspread gathering the rainbow sprays, and the myriads of hooded mosses, every cup fresh and shining.